I used to believe that life's most important people sometimes appear only once, brief, impactful, then gone, leaving memories folded into the corners of your mind. Elena was one of those people. She was my literature teacher when I was 17. Not the kind who lectured endlessly from the front of the classroom, but someone who seemed to speak into the room, her words deliberately shaping the silence around her. I remember the first time she handed back my essay, her fingers resting on the paper a moment longer than necessary. "Stay after class," she said softly. I obeyed, heart thudding. When the room emptied, she leaned casually on her desk and said, "You write like someone who feels everything and says nothing." I didn't know whether to be proud or embarrassed. She smiled then, not indulgently, not warmly, but knowingly, as though she could see the threads of thought tangled inside me. That brief encounter didn't mean anything at the time, and yet it lodged inside me, quietly. I spent the rest of that year trying to match my words to her expectations. Trying to be perceptive enough to earn her approval, though I never dared to speak my own thoughts aloud beyond assignments and class discussions. Years passed. After graduation, I moved to a small city for work, living in an apartment with peeling paint and a view of a dusty street where nothing remarkable ever happened. I started a routine: wake, work, come home, eat, sleep. Life was steady and predictable, and I clung to that steadiness as if it could protect me from the raw memories of my teenage years. Yet, Elena's voice, her calm authority, her insistence that words carry weight, lingered. Occasionally, I would walk past a bookstore or glance at a shelf of poetry and hear it, as if she were quietly standing beside me, nudging me to pay attention to something deeper. Then, when I was 25, the past collided with the present in the most unexpected way. I was browsing a small, dimly lit bookstore, the kind where the floorboards creak and the air smells faintly of old paper and coffee, when I heard a voice behind me. Soft, deliberate, measured. "You still read the same things." I turned. Elena. She looked older, of course, but the years had only given her a quiet strength. Her hair was streaked with gray, her eyes held more depth, and yet her presence was exactly as I remembered. Not the same teacher, not the same authority figure, but a person who had once seen me, really seen me. We talked. First awkwardly, then comfortably. She had left teaching years ago, worked as an editor, lived nearby, and still visited this bookstore. I spoke about my work, my quiet routines, my attempts at writing, and she listened. Listened without judgment, without expectation, just presence. That evening, we agreed to coffee. Just coffee. But coffee became conversation. Conversation became dinner. Dinners became shared walks. Shared walks became evenings together. There was no rush, no dramatic declarations, only a steady merging of our lives, subtle and inevitable. We didn't rush. Everything unfolded with a careful deliberation. Almost ceremoniously. Thursday evenings became our ritual. We met at the same cafe, the one tucked between a flower shop and a small stationery store, where the light fell softly across the worn wooden tables. We talked for hours, about books, about trivialities, about life's small disappointments. Sometimes silence stretched between us, comfortable and deep, like we were rediscovering each other one quiet moment at a time. At first, there was a strange tension. I was no longer a student. She was no longer a teacher. But in those first few weeks, we both seemed to test the boundaries. Small gestures carried weight. The way she would brush a strand of hair behind her ear, her hand lingering just a second longer than necessary. The way I noticed the careful way she arranged sugar packets on the table before brewing her tea. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it marked the difference between our past and the present. I remember one particular evening vividly. A storm had rolled in, and rain tapped lightly against the cafe windows. We were seated by the corner, steaming cups of jasmine tea before us. She was speaking about a manuscript she was editing, and I listened, enthralled not just by her words but by the way she carried herself, poised, confident, yet approachable. I realized in that moment that my admiration had quietly transformed into something far more potent. And yet, I did not speak of it. Not immediately. I had learned from my own teenage insecurities that feelings spoken too soon could unravel delicate threads. So I waited, letting our connection deepen naturally. Weeks turned into months. Our rituals persisted. Coffee became lunch, lunch became dinner, dinner became shared weekends. Slowly, seamlessly, our lives intertwined. Her apartment, previously sterile and organized, became warm with my presence. My apartment, empty and quiet, suddenly felt irrelevant as hers became the place where I returned, the center around which my days revolved. Despite the gradual intimacy, life's demands intruded. She worked long hours as an editor, often buried in manuscripts and deadlines. I had my own responsibilities, my own routines. Occasionally, I noticed her distraction, a delayed response to a message, a sigh too long in the evening, eyes lingering on the laptop screen instead of on me. I felt a pang of anxiety each time, but I also recognized a pattern. She was cautious, perhaps wary of our age difference, perhaps hesitant to blur lines she had once carefully drawn. One night, after a long day of work, I walked her home. The streets were quiet, the air crisp and scented faintly with autumn leaves. She stopped at her door, and neither of us spoke immediately. There was a pause, a suspension in time, like the world had narrowed to just us. She looked at me, really looked, and said softly, "You've changed. You've grown." I felt my chest tighten. Not with fear, not with desire, but with recognition. I, too, had changed. The shy, cautious boy she had once taught was gone, replaced by a man who understood his own worth and had learned patience in love. That night, our first kiss was gentle, almost ceremonial. No passion, no urgency, just acknowledgement. Recognition that the bridge between past and present had been built carefully, with understanding and mutual respect. Months later, we decided to live together. It was a small apartment, modest and unassuming, but it became ours. I remember unpacking the first box of my belongings, books, a few old letters, a guitar I had long neglected. She helped, silently, placing things thoughtfully in their new places. Every corner of that apartment began to tell our story, the way the curtains fell, the faint aroma of tea she always brewed in the evenings, the scattered papers and manuscripts that chronicled her work. Domestic life was not perfect. We had disagreements over trivialities, the proper placement of furniture, whose turn it was to clean the kitchen, whether classical music or silence was better in the mornings. But these small disputes never escalated. They were navigated with care, a dance of mutual respect and compromise. Through these small conflicts, I learned patience. Through her attentiveness, she learned to trust that I would stand by her decisions. And then came the day I realized I wanted to ask her to marry me. It was not dramatic, not sudden. It was a thought that had grown quietly over months, rooted in shared routines, shared silences, and the deep, unwavering connection that had been nurtured patiently. I wanted to spend my life not in grand gestures, but in the quiet certainty of daily companionship with her. I remember the day I decided to ask her to marry me. It wasn't a dramatic revelation. I didn't kneel in a park or plan some elaborate evening. I simply realized, while folding laundry one Sunday afternoon, that I could no longer imagine my life without her. That thought, quiet and insistent, refused to leave. I bought a small ring. Nothing extravagant. A simple gold band, understated, like the life we had built together. It felt right. It felt like us. When I finally showed it to her, I was nervous in a way I hadn't been in years. Not because of the act itself, but because I feared she might see me differently, might hesitate. Her eyes softened when she saw the ring. She didn't say anything immediately. She just took my hand, turning it over gently in hers. "You really mean it," she whispered. I nodded. "I mean it more than I can say. I want to live my life with you." She smiled, that calm, steady smile that had first captivated me when I was 17. "Then yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." But the world outside was not as gentle. Rumors began to ripple through the community. Friends, neighbors, even distant relatives whispered. They questioned our relationship, our motives, the decades-long teacher-student past that now seemed to overshadow everything. Some assumed I had been manipulated. Others suggested she had crossed boundaries. Even strangers, with their half-heard stories and assumptions, found opinions to share. We tried to ignore it. We focused on ourselves, on our routines, on the joy of planning a life together. But whispers have weight. They seep into cracks, even in the strongest foundations. I felt the first stirrings of doubt one evening while we were sitting on our small balcony. The city lights twinkled faintly, and she was telling me about an editorial decision she had made. Her voice was calm, measured, yet I could sense hesitation beneath it. "Do you ever wonder what people think?" I asked carefully. She looked at me, a little startled. Then smiled faintly. "Sometimes. But their opinions aren't our life. They can talk, we live." I nodded, but the unease lingered. I realized that even the strongest love can face unseen pressures, social judgment, history, memory, and must be navigated deliberately. The wedding preparations themselves became a test. It was a small ceremony, held in a quiet garden behind the city library. Autumn leaves fell softly, gold and red, as if nature itself had chosen to witness us. Only a handful of guests were invited. Our closest friends, some family who had accepted our union without question, and a few colleagues who understood the nuances of our story. Even there was subtle tension. A relative's whispered comment about ethics, a friend's awkward glance, a distant uncle's hesitated congratulations. But Elena and I moved through it together, silently reinforcing each other with small touches, a hand on the back, a smile, a shared glance that said we know, and it doesn't matter. On the day itself, I remember standing beside her, taking her hand in mine as the officiant spoke. I looked at her face, the woman who had once been my teacher, who had guided me through words, through literature, through the quiet growth of my mind, and I realized how far we had both come. Not without struggle, not without doubt, but together. "I do," I whispered when it was our turn. And she whispered it back. It wasn't a theatrical moment. No fireworks, no dramatic music. Just quiet certainty. The kind that feels like roots taking hold, steady, unwavering. Even in marriage, life continued to test us. There were times when old insecurities returned, subtle arguments about trivialities, moments of doubt fueled by the outside world's judgment. But we learned to navigate them. I learned patience, not the kind that waits silently, but the kind that observes, reflects, and chooses deliberate responses. She learned trust. Trust in me, in us, and in the love that had grown quietly. Patiently, over years. We shared quiet mornings, breakfast on the balcony, books in the afternoon sunlight, cups of tea in the evenings. We celebrated small victories, a manuscript completed, a project at work finished, a quiet night without argument. And we comforted each other in losses, disappointments, failures, with the calm certainty that neither would leave the other to face it alone. Years passed. Marriage was not a constant fairy tale, and I don't mean that in a bitter way. Life has a rhythm that refuses to pause, and love, even the deepest love, must adjust to that rhythm. Bills needed paying, projects required attention, friends and family demanded time. But amidst the everyday chaos, there was a quiet sanctuary, our home, our routines, the shared space where small gestures carried more meaning than grand declarations. I remember one Sunday morning when Elena and I were sitting in our kitchen, sunlight spilling over the table. I had my notebook open, scribbling thoughts for a story I was slowly crafting, while she sipped her coffee, reviewing a manuscript. A gentle breeze rustled the curtains. She looked at me and smiled. Not in the way someone smiles to charm or to please, but in a way that acknowledged all we had endured together. "You've changed," she said. "I see it in the way you hold yourself now." I laughed softly. "I've learned," I said, "to pay attention, to breathe, to accept that life isn't about control but about choices." She reached over, touching my hand briefly, a gesture full of history and trust. That moment, ordinary, quiet, yet profound, made me realize the depth of our bond. It wasn't a bond of passion alone, nor of youth, nor of circumstance. It was a bond forged in patience, respect, and the deliberate act of staying, understanding, and growing together. The challenges never truly disappeared. Occasionally, someone would question our past, or make a veiled remark, or simply let assumptions color their words. But by then, we had cultivated a resilience stronger than judgment. I learned an important lesson: it wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about being steadfast, being present, being true. Love was not a shield against criticism or an escape from reality. It was a conscious, daily decision to honor the connection we had built, without letting fear or expectation dictate our actions. And then, one winter evening, after a long day of work, I sat by the window watching the snow fall. Elena was across the room, arranging her books, humming softly to herself. The apartment smelled of fresh tea and the faint warmth of wood from the heater. I reflected on the journey we had traveled, the awkwardness of rediscovering each other, the whispered judgments of the world, the doubts that had once gnawed at the edges of our connection. And I realized, not with triumph, but with quiet certainty, that everything had been necessary. The past had shaped us. The judgments had tested us. The distance we had overcome had strengthened us. And now, here we were, whole, not despite the challenges, but because of them. I stood, crossing the room to her side. She looked up, curious. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked softly. She paused, then shook her head. "Not for a second," she said. "Every step brought us here." I took her hand in mine. Not as a teacher and student, not as a man and a woman defined by others' expectations, but simply as two people who had chosen each other. Again and again, through time, through judgment, through life itself. In that moment, I understood the final truth: love is not about possession, nor about perfection, nor about escaping the world's scrutiny. Love is about choosing to stay, to grow, to forgive, and to act with integrity, not only toward the other, but toward yourself. The moral is quiet but profound. Life rarely unfolds according to plan. People change. Circumstances shift. Expectations fail. But dignity, self-respect, and deliberate love are choices we make every day. By cultivating them, we find not only love in others, but the enduring love of ourselves. I no longer look at our past with regret, nor at the world with resentment. I look at it with understanding. We are imperfect. Life is imperfect, but we are capable of profound grace. And that grace, quiet, patient, steady, is enough.